Welcome to Teaching Artist Podcast, a show dedicated to discussions of teaching art to kids, making art, and how those things overlap and feed each other. I'm Rebecca Potts, your host, a visual arts teaching artist.
Each week, I'm sharing a featured artist as well as a guest interview. I'll share a bit about the featured artist here, as well as sharing images of their work on Instagram and on the website. This week's featured artist is Erin Friedman. Erin is an abstract artist based just outside of Washington, D.C. in Bethesda, Maryland. She has always been captivated by the experience and process of creating. Erin's love of painting since childhood led her to study art in college at the University of Maryland. She graduated with a BFA in painting and a concentration in design. She gradually refined her process and found her niche in abstract mixed media work. Erin's goal is to make people feel deeply when they see her work. Her inspiration comes from moments and reactions to everyday life experiences. Emotions have a great impact on her work and influence her paintings in a variety of ways. She believes in embracing these feelings and allowing them to become a part of her creative process. As her style continues to evolve, her process remains as intimate as ever. She brings her personality as a sensitive and empathetic truth seeker to every blank canvas. Each piece is deeply personal. Erin's work is free from formal structure and open to interpretation, a style that she hopes causes viewers to think about what the piece means to them. Before pursuing her art full-time, Erin spent over a decade working as a graphic illustrator, where her clients included Warner Brothers, Mars Retail, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Working for internationally recognized brands taught Erin the importance of providing an excellent experience for clients. When she is not creating, Erin is chasing after her 3 energetic young children, Max, Silas, and Ozzy. And a bit from her statement, Erin says she is fueled by her art, which has been pouring out of her since childhood. When she paints, she is fully immersed in the work. Nothing inspires her more than the complexity of emotions. She aims to capture the essence of the human experience in her work. We all experience conflict, change, joy, and sadness. Erin does her best to embrace this process and allow those feelings to be revealed throughout her work. Her paintings are created by pouring mixed acrylic onto a canvas and then building layers with paint using a palette knife. She makes marks, alters her ideas, adds layers, and changes directions. Some pieces include marks from charcoal or wax pastel. The final images are free from formal structure and open to interpretation. Each piece is deeply personal, centered around embracing everything she feels and the connection that comes from our shared emotions. To see some of Erin's work, check out our blog at teachingartistpodcast.com, or make sure you're following us on Instagram at teachingartistpodcast. And if you would like to submit your work to be featured, you can do that on our website at teachingartistpodcast.com/opportunities. Speaking with Jess was so inspiring and educational for me. I learned from her and tried to soak up her way of being with her students, with her body, within liminal space. She talked about her experiences at the intersection of many identities and how that has shaped her as a teacher, as an artist, and as a human. She shared some incredible dialogical investigations she's facilitated with students, digging into deep questions about time, fear, and love. We got into the systems of oppression and how we as teachers can create change. I loved her way of talking about teachers as the buffer between the systems of power and our students. we can break the rules and be a protective barrier for our students. This was such a powerful and helpful conversation. Jess Rogawski is a San Diego-based artist and educator from Chicago, Illinois, who currently works with students from Southeast San Diego and Baja, California, Mexico. Her practice as an artist explores the connections between art and revolution. The portals she creates, often made collaboratively, stand simultaneously as symbols of her own journey of self-healing, as well as the collective, decolonial healing needed to change the world. She aims to answer the questions: what life lessons can we learn as individuals and as society from the metaphor of a portal? How can we embrace liminality as a tool of resistance in a binary world? And how can imagination be a form of resistance? Her approach to art education centers student voice and well-being through dialogue and community, challenging the expectations of and hierarchies within the classroom. She invites her art students to consider their inner and outer landscapes through mindfulness practices and self-exploration, in addition to observing and interpreting contemporary art and culture. The students are encouraged to critically examine the social and historical realities and systems that impact them as individuals as well as their communities, including the institution of school itself. She is invested in co-creating expressive art experiences with students to question and investigate personal culture as well as society through art and action. Now more than ever, we need students to be able to creatively and critically think about solutions for our world and to act on them. Let's hear from Jess. I am speaking with Jess Rogawski today, and I love to just start with some background. Could you kind of walk us through your journey as an artist and an educator?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
So yes, my name is Jess Rogawski, and I'm a San Diego-based artist and educator from Chicago, Illinois, who currently works with students from Southeast San Diego and Baja, California.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the big old origin story.
Yes.
Here we go. Well, I feel what's maybe a little, interesting about my story is that right from the get-go, I kind of was sort of put towards more of the teaching side. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Mm-hmm. One of them, I would say, definitely coming from a working middle class background, is when I told my mom, when I was 18, like, what do you want to be? And I was like, an artist. And she said, absolutely not.
Yeah.
How are you going to make money? Was her first concern. Mm-hmm. Like a lot of working middle class folks, I had to basically, if I wanted college, I had to take out loans, right? And mm-hmm. my mom refused to co-sign on my student loan if I were to go with just a studio art major. So it became a compromise for sure, where I ended up going to the University of Illinois at Chicago, and they have a art education program. So you can go in straight for your BFA. Actually, I don't think the program exists anymore. I know some of the professors have moved to other universities, SAIC, the School of the Art Institute being one of them.
Yeah. So
I ended up at the time electing to be an art teacher from the get-go as a sort of like I mentioned, a compromise between my mom. And it was definitely begrudgingly that I agreed, but I was 18. I wanted to get out of the house. And so, the way that the program I attended works is that you take your art classes, you have studio classes, and then like many teacher preparation programs, right? Then take education classes. And then your senior thesis ends up being a student show of your students' artwork, which is really interesting because I kind of trace back my beliefs about what an artist is and who gets to be one, and just sort of the understanding of the term through little bits and pieces like this. Like when I'm saying this now, I wonder if I would have been in a different place in my journey if then I was given a show for my own art at the time, in addition to a final show of my students' art. Because I feel like a lot of teacher preparation programs, particularly the ones that are preparing art teachers to go out into the field, how your teacher education program really affects your understanding of these terms and these different roles we hold as teachers and artists and teaching artists. There are some programs that do give more legitimacy to your own practice as an artist through things like having a final show, right, at the end of graduation. Yeah, it was an incredible experience. I had the opportunity to work with Olivia Goody through her Spiral Workshop, which is essentially a Saturday school run for Chicago public school students. And it's taught by pre-service teachers in collaboration with Olivia Goody. And I must say, so much of my pedagogy and understanding and philosophy as a teacher comes from that experience and my teacher preparation program. And what's interesting is that, kind of reflecting back and thinking about later on in my career, kind of stepping into my role as an artist, looking back, I had more of a separated view of like what my teaching practice was versus, what my art was. And I think now when I think about my upbringing and my own education, I have this feeling that teachers are conceptual artists in and of themselves, and, you kind of think about what is a conceptual artist, but someone who creates experiences through activities or tasks and events. And I think as a teacher, like that's what I do. So it's interesting thinking about my label or what I am, but I think I've gotten to a point where when I introduce myself and talk about myself, I'm very confident in saying like, hi, I'm Jess Rogawski and I'm an artist, and leaving it at that because like I'd mentioned before, curriculum development is an art form in my mind. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. And thinking through how the preparation programs prepare you or don't and what impact that has to say, okay, you've spent 4 years or however long studying this and working towards this degree, and your sort of culmination of all of it is show the work that your students have done and none of the work that you have done. Although, there's work that you've done tied up in that, in what your students have done. But you're right that it sort of sets this precedent and this idea that your own artistic voice, your own art is not as worthy.
Right. Because it's so interrelated, I guess. And going back to at first being very resentful at having to be, an art teacher to be able to afford to go to school. I began to love it. I fell in love with working with young people, being the pulse of the future. I'm so continually inspired by my students. And that speaks back to the interrelationship of these titles, of these roles that we hold space for. And I just want to also throw out my appreciation for you and creating a place for stories to be told. I think that's so important for the field and for progress. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
I haven't said it already. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I feel like I started not really realizing what impact it could have and the importance of exactly what you said, just sharing these stories and these experiences really more sort of selfishly. Like, I want to not be alone in juggling these things and trying to figure out, like, who am I as an artist? Who am I as a teacher? Where do those things come together?
I think that's a question I've been asking myself my whole life. Who am I? What is happening here? And what should I do? And where am I going? That quest for meaning. And it's interesting, as I've gotten older, I've really, as a mixed person, as a bisexual, and as a person who held space for these two roles, opposing roles sometimes, artist versus teacher, I feel like I've had to really maybe ask myself that question more than your average person because of how my identity in and of itself has so many intersections of different groups and people. I mean, I think about artist teacher too, coming from a working middle class background, I've always had to have that idea of like, how am I going to survive in the background? And I've had to have a lot of second jobs and what do they call them these days? Side hustles.
Yep.
I think this year actually is the first year that I'm going to have one of those, as people in the teaching profession so often this gets thrown around a lot. I feel like, oh, that cushy summer off, here we go. But I've had to maintain a second job my entire 7 years as a teacher, working in food service and retail and different sort of ways to to be honest, keep paying that student loan that I'm still chugging away for. And I think the assumption is that to be an artist, you know, and this is in my experience with working in these sort of other industries, is that you meet some of the most creative people. Mm-hmm. So many artists work in service jobs. I've met and connected and networked with so many creatives in the service industry, just coming from my particular background. And then, you know, on the other side of it, right, it's like the teacher, which in society has, I feel like, maintained some sort of respect, maybe in some more so in other cultures than not. But it's like, oh, you're a teacher, you know, and I'm sure maybe you might experience this when you introduce yourself just to new friends or acquaintances or whatnot. And you can either say, hi, I'm an artist, or hey, I'm a teacher. Mm-hmm. And that comes with a whole set of preconceived notions and assumptions as to what that is. And often, sometimes it guides their behavior and how much they respect you. Mm-hmm. Like when you're wearing an apron versus when people see you in the classroom, it's very fascinating to me. Mm-hmm. Just the disparity sometimes that comes out. And it's actually really harmful too. But completely, in order not to be really truly bothered by it, you have to kind of detach yourself in considering these notions. And my position as someone who's had my feet in a lot of different worlds, I can.
Yeah. Oh, that's so true. It's interesting because I think of the way I introduce myself and exactly what you're saying. What identity do I choose to share? And knowing how that's going to affect the reaction and the respect that teachers, I mean, I guess, yes, we do get a certain level of respect, but then it feels almost cushioned with this sort of, you know, those who teach can't do. And
sometimes yes, I know what you're talking about in the art world, but we have to be careful to talk about like, well, what art world, right? Because inherently a lot of times the art world is a very classist space.
Oh, totally. Classist, sexist, racist.
Absolutely.
All the ists.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, what do we even concern ourselves with? Mm-hmm. Really? But tapping into that question, who am I, and being grounded in, even although having my feet in many worlds, or two worlds, if you will, you know, you create your own space, like that third space. Mm-hmm.
I love that.
There's power in that.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. And I love also what you were talking about with the service industry, just the really complete lack of respect that people that make that choice or, you know, out of necessity are in that industry. But talking about creatives, I feel like there's so many artists who decide, like, I don't want to go into education. I'm going to do a job that I can really, really just leave at the door and be able to focus on my art. And that's, I mean, I respect that choice completely.
And it's, it's tragic, the amount of disrespect that people in this service industry experience. And I've seen it in loved ones, families, friends, myself. Mm-hmm. I'm currently in San Diego and I'm from Chicago. And it's interesting because historically there's been a lot of segregation and you see it all over the country. There's this coded language about the north side versus the south side in Chicago. And in San Diego, it's like everyone knows when you talk about La Jolla, what kind of maybe mentality sometimes is facilitated through the isolation and segregation of certain social classes, really, in my mind. And anyway, that, you know, I worked at a fancy organic grocery store, and that's often in these public spaces where the classes rub up against each other. Mm-hmm. You know, someone's going and buying their not to sound bitter, but like, because I understand, like, people have food sensitivities and all that stuff, you know, but they're gluten-free, vegan bread.
Yeah.
And has to ask someone behind the counter, hi, can you slice this please for me? And just the amount of like dehumanizing that happens sometimes from one end to the other. And like, you see that in places like the grocery store. Mm-hmm. And being on that other side, wearing the apron, you know, you see incredible human beings just reduced to something that's non-human. And it's so unfortunate. There's so many musicians, there's so many photographers, painters, graph writers, with so much, how do I say this? I feel like there is this sometimes assumption that if you're in a service job, you're less than from some people, right? And it's like, no, these people are totally misinformed when it comes to who's the human behind the apron, right? And what they have to offer and what they're doing. Like, not everyone has a choice to not work and just focus on their art, right? Some people have to survive, pay rent, pay the bills. And it's just so interesting. That's something that's always been a part of my journey as someone who's had to have more than one job since I've been 19 years old.
Yeah. And do you feel like that influences the way you connect with students and the way you kind of like it comes into your teaching?
I mean, in some respects, I guess that makes me more empathetic and understanding to a lot of like being of the same class as the students that you're serving. In a certain way, like you understand like what parents and community members are going through. Whereas so often I've seen working in communities that have been historically oppressed and are experiencing the grips of and consequences of poverty at large, systemically.
Yeah.
You know, there's this white saviorism where we're well-educated, privileged white folk come in to teach in certain communities, and they're very removed from the experiences of their students' lives in the way that they've never had to experience certain things. And in a way, I am entirely privileged and don't understand the experiences of my students, being that, I mean, I have students where their basic human needs are not being met. Primarily, my teaching experience has been in the public school system from the get-go. I worked for Chicago Public Schools. I worked for a year in Marietta Valley Unified as well as San Diego Unified since 2018. And let me tell you, working for the public school system, it inspires a lot of rage. It does, just to see the injustices happening from the educational system as another colonial system that works to harm and oppress students of color.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And just seeing even within one system, the crazy inequities that are happening across from neighborhood to neighborhood. And,
it's wild.
Yeah, you talked about earlier how like these sort of dividing lines that happen in every city, every town. And, you see that within all the systems too. Like, where is the funding going? And
it's all about money. It's like we've been commodified, if that's not already apparent. And I feel like working for a public system, whether you're in healthcare or in a lot of different capacities, you open your eyes to the fact that it's a money game. And this kind of, I don't know if this is, if I'm jumping too much or getting off topic, but since this is the Teaching Artist podcast, I'd love to hear your opinion on this too. But in terms of like, if we're thinking about the public school system and art education and workers' rights, do you see the increase of part-time, unbenefited teaching artist positions in public schools as undermining the art teaching profession?
I mean, I think it's really, really complicated. Like I'm incredibly frustrated at the really systemic lack of art education, this idea that it's not necessary, that it's not worthy of funding, that teachers in general having to really fight for their rights as workers, fight to unionize and, do strike repeatedly to have decent working hours for not only themselves, but their students as well. Strike, like here in Los Angeles, we had a strike maybe a few years ago, and a big sticking point was we need counselors in every school. This is not about, I want more days off. This is my students desperately need someone to speak to about these major issues in their lives, and it's not being provided. And I'm not trained as a counselor, as a teacher. Like, we need trained professionals.
Teachers are often vilified.
Right. Completely. There's sort of that side of it. But then I'm a teaching artist. So I work for a nonprofit that sends artists into schools, and I'm not certified. And I feel like there's some benefits to that. Like, I have a lot of freedom in terms of my curricula, and even my sort of hours are more flexible a little bit. I don't have to do all the grading, which is kind of nice. But then it's also like, how am I making a living on this? It's, I don't think I would be able to without a partner, a spouse who's making a lot more than I am, or, before COVID. that sort of shifted everything. But
And that's so, it's so fascinating to me because I was never officially a teaching artist through the capacity of working in the public schools, but I did experience something close to that. And it's called visiting teacher. And before I landed a temporary 1-year contract with San Diego Unified, I was able to have this position called visiting teacher. And technically you were listed as part-time, but you had the ability to like pick up more hours. Obviously, since there's a great need for, we sort of functioned as substitutes in a way, like in the eyes of the district, like in terms of pay rate and no benefits, right? No health benefits.
Right.
However, what was asked of us was sort of egregious in terms of like what we were doing. And there were some really cool perks with the job, that I got to teach visual art and I didn't have to assess, right? Which I think is, in a way, like I didn't get into teaching in the public schools to assess kids. Like that's not my MO, but it's a part of my capacity and job. So I do it. However, going back to the visiting teacher thing, I also got to come in for the day at a site. I ended up probably going to about 15 different sites in San Diego Unified. So I had just moved to San Diego. So I really got to learn and know about San Diego through that job. And I got to leave it, when I left. There was none of that traditional, like from what I was used to coming from Chicago. You clock out at 3:30, but you laugh because you're like, why am I even punching out? Because I know I'm going to have 2 hours worth of lesson planning and grading when I get home. It was when I had this visiting teacher position. I also concurrently was working a second job at a grocery store. And it was during that period that I actually had time to create a body of work because I got to leave the schoolwork at school during that time when I was part-time and doing visiting teaching. Which in a way it was, because we were actually required to be certified for that position, the classroom teachers left. They actually had PLC. It was actually a great way to not only provide the students with art experiences, and there was like a dance teacher that would come in as well, and music and theater. The classroom teachers got planning time, which if you've ever been in the capacity of teaching, that collaboration is necessary. It's a necessary part of your craft. And it had its pitfalls in a way, because a lot of it had to do with, I was like, so I'm single, unmarried. Well, I'm in a relationship, but I'm unmarried, single to the law. Right.
Right.
But, and I moved to California and didn't really know anyone. And anyway, long story short, I was like, how am I going to survive on part-time work here in Southern California? Like, I don't have that safety blanket or any kind of extra income. So that's when I continued to work at Whole Foods at the time. But I just wanted to get your opinion on that, because it's really fascinating if we're thinking about workers' rights and legitimizing and funding art education through the public school system, because a lot of them are outsourcing their art education to these organizations. Yeah. And in a way, I'm happy that at least the students are getting some sort of art, but in a way, it's like, what happened to funding a full-time art teacher in every elementary school? Right. That is not a reality in the public school system.
Yeah. And you don't see them going and getting rid of all the English teachers and looking to a nonprofit. Oh, can you bring us just some people who know how to read? Like,
and you're like, oh my gosh.
No.
And I think it's this whole idea of what is the core subjects, right? This language of, well, these are essential, but, to me, that is colonial in nature, that experts know best. And it's a passion of mine to disrupt that notion in my class and thinking, about the district at large. Who are you to say that art isn't core? Because it's been, for me, it saved my life. Yeah. I hated school. I still hate school. And it's so funny because I'm a teacher, but I'm really passionate about education.
It's interesting though. I feel like I hear that really often, that so many of the teachers I've spoken to really struggled with school and just never enjoyed it, had a lot of trouble.
You want to make it different. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I've heard this again and again, wanting to help students that they see themselves in.
If it wasn't for art class or rugby, I played rugby in high school.
Yeah.
I would have never gone to school.
Mm.
I was miserable. There's something about it always felt so unnatural to me and very, gearing people for the Industrial Revolution, moving at the sound of bells.
Mm-hmm.
Like I didn't want to have anything with it.
Yeah. Well, you talked earlier also about assessment, and it made me think kind of along that same line. The word assessment brings up ideas of like, what grade are you giving? And even these sort of rubrics and all the ways that we write down on paper how students are progressing that really come from like they're based in this very biased system. But when you also think about assessment, it's something we do naturally all the time as teachers. We're always like assessing our teaching, assessing each student and kind of seeing like, okay, where do they need a little help? Where are they doing really well that I can encourage?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So finding, I guess trying to somehow bypass that system and just continue the natural assessment that's happening. If you're a good teacher, like you're always kind of doing that in your head without necessarily, I don't know if realizing it or just thinking about it and putting it down on paper. Maybe the system just wants it all on paper.
Well, in my opinion, I think the system uses assessment to inflict violence and harm on students.
Yes.
An F will stay with you on your transcript, right? And that is a legal document. And it may be taking this to the extreme or maybe it isn't, but that's the way in which I see teachers moving like cops. It's through assessment and discipline. These systems that we create within our field are ways in which we assign judgment, right? And I've had conversations with students and talking about grades, and a lot of them speak to the idea of self-worth being tied to a letter grade or a score. And, we see this also proliferated with college acceptance and the increase of standardized testing. And, a lot of that has to do with data and money, about how the educational system has sold out to companies who are interested in student data. And there's a lot of like racist practices and things that happen with this data.
Yeah, totally. And you talked earlier also about teachers, this sort of white saviorism and teachers not understanding the cultural sort of where their students are coming from and that there's cultural things that are happening as well as just like human things. Like I am a high school student working because my family needs the money and I was up till midnight trying to finish my homework after my part-time job. And now I'm falling asleep in your class and you're going to give me an F because of that. Instead of just saying, hey, I noticed that you seem really tired. Are you okay? Is there anything you need help with?
Yeah, it's dehumanizing students and it's made it into this punitive punishment system. And a step I think towards the right direction would be through standards-based grading where you are taking out participation grades, grades of behavior, grades for compliance. Did you just do the thing? Because a lot of the times you don't understand the barriers or obstacles that could prevent the student from doing the thing, whether it's a parent signature on a syllabus or otherwise. Yeah. And, speaking to that gap between teachers and their students, at least in the public schools, that traces back to the accessibility and availability for people of color to become teachers.
Yes.
How our profession is dominated by cis, white, straight women.
Yep. Raising my hand.
And it's not the only solution to help bolster more diversity within our field, but it's a start, Yeah.
And then I feel like we've been talking a lot about what are all of these problems, all of these challenges. And I want to talk about the solutions or like what are the steps towards making this better, towards maybe it has to get worse first, like dismantling all of it and fixing it. I don't know that we have those answers, but yeah.
I love talking about solutions.
Yes.
Absolutely.
It can feel so much more hopeful, right?
And I think of this Angela Davis quote that's been really inspiring me lately, which is, you have to act as if you can radically transform the world. You have to do it all the time. she's been a big inspiration for me in thinking about how to approach the problems. And for me, and in my teaching practice / art practice, what I'm really invested in is creating change in the classroom first.
Mm-hmm.
Can you trust your students to take over the classroom? Can you really let go? Can you really trust in the idea that experts don't know best, that you could actually learn from your students? Can you question the power hierarchies within the very walls that you go to every day, or virtual walls, I guess? And that's a start. And you need to co-create those things together and build expectations and common ground, essentially creating a community. That's what I'm curious about now looking forward. And I have things that I have my students do called like the Teach Me Anything project, where we discuss like, well, what is a teacher? What qualifies someone to be a teacher? How do you know you've learned something to the point where you could teach someone else and help someone? And then we throw the question out there like, okay, well, what can you teach? What can you teach? What can you teach? And right now I have some independent study students that is sort of my like testing ground for sometimes new projects I'm developing, that we're developing actually, because I need to be mindful of my language. Yes, because for me, solutions must be co-created because you have ownership in it, and then you become more invested. It's like you got to care, then you got to think, and then you got to act on it. That's kind of been my motto moving forward. In addition, I'm also a trained yoga and meditation teacher. So with the pandemic and online learning here, I've really leaned on my skills in that realm and have started my students every Monday with a Mindful Monday, where we focus on mindfulness practices and self-reflection and exploration using a variety of techniques of breathing, embodiment exercises, where students ground. And then we go through guided visualizations where my students use their imaginations about various self-reflective topics. And one of the things we have gone through is this idea of time travel. And now that may sound a little out there right now, but I do have to say that one of the main student concerns, at least that I've taken away from what they've been telling me, is that like adults don't care about teenage mental health. And in a way, these Mindful Mondays centerizes student well-being, where we talk about dealing with depression and anxiety almost as, unfortunately, like a normal occurrence in students who are of this age going through the collective experience of the pandemic. And so we talk about how anxiety kind of makes you travel to the future, right? Because you're stressing out about what could happen, what could be. And depression is almost like a way that a force that pulls you to the past. And then we talk about the present moment and how sometimes that could be the scariest place to be, that third space.
Totally.
And then we make art about it, or we journal. So the students have the option to express whatever they want to express in any way. Very like art therapy minded. And none of this gets assessed in the way that you would traditionally think about your projects. And it's interesting because I feel like some teachers might be, well, how do you get engagement if you don't have leverage? Like you got to do this. It's because the students actually want to do what we're doing on Mindful Mondays. They see the value in it. And I ask them about it all the time. Like, what will you remember most about this course? And they always point to Mindful Mondays. Because I think it relieves a lot of the pressures of what you produce must be judged or scrutinized.
Yeah, that's so hard.
And for me, when I let go of that notion in my own art making, that's when I really tapped in and was able to, I couldn't stop making paintings. That fear of creating, the students come up with a lot of really fascinating sketches and musings. I asked them to meet up with their future self and to really visualize it and think about where they see their life headed. And I prompt them to have conversations with their future self. And then similarly, we also go back in time and I have them sort of give counsel to themselves when they were younger. And I have them imagine that younger version of them. Because high school students can be very nostalgic. At that point, I think that's the biggest difference with teaching high school students is they're already jaded to the system.
Right.
They're in mourning for a freer, happier sometimes version of themselves that wasn't bogged down by all this responsibility and pressure that the system places on them at that age.
Yeah, completely. I love that, conversations with the future self, and then also kind of going back and Yes, you're, talking about this as sort of time travel is such a poetic and beautiful way to put it, but also I feel like something that students can grab onto and take action with, which is really, really helpful.
I mean, I feel like this sort of leads into this idea of the portal. I keep mentioning the third space. And in terms of my most recent body of work, the portals of possibility, that idea, I originally was made aware of the symbol of a portal from students. When I was a visiting teacher working in San Diego, I was working with elementary aged children. And you know how students often talk about and depict symbols and characters from their visual diet, right? The media and images that they consume on a daily. And I, all of a sudden, all my students, they'd be like, yeah, portal this, portal that. And I'm like, what do you mean portal? And they're like, yeah, Stranger Things, Minecraft, Fortnite, Rick and Morty, Skyrim. And there's actually a video game named Portals. And I'm like, what? Tell me more. Tell me more about this portal you speak of. And it eventually evolved into this lesson where, I was like, okay, I have this investment in expressive mark making in terms of my art practice. I've always, maybe it also has to do with me being a rugby player, but I've always been really active and gestural with my approach to making marks. I don't know if you're familiar with Matthew Barney. He was the art jock dude.
Yeah.
Drawing restraint where he's bouncing on a trampoline with weights and he's drawing on his ceiling. I always consider myself an art jock in a way.
I love that.
And being a rugby player. And so I was thinking, how could I pair this expressive mark making? I had an expressive mark making project that I've been developing over my years as a teacher. And, we kind of tap into those inner directionalities that you just kind of subconsciously have when you approach a blank page, and I'll put on a metronome, ting, 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 right? Like it has this little beat. And then I instruct students to, okay, make marks to the metronome with your right arm. Okay, switch it to your non-dominant or, the other side, right? The left or whatnot. And then I have them make marks with both hands. And then I make the beat go faster and faster and faster. And I have them use multiple pages of paper. And anyway, long story short, I had this lesson, right? How to make a portal. And in a way, me thinking about this concept as an artist, I see the portal as a third space, right? It's the in-between space, the liminal space, if you will. I was also reading Gloria Anzaldúa at the time, who is a Chicana philosopher, educator, who has a lot of work about the border. And also being in San Diego, which is a border town, right, to Tijuana. And I kind of put it all together and had students think about the portal as a symbol or a metaphor for a life lesson in a way. What kind of concepts do portals bring up? And a lot of the times they're seen as a door, right? And when we're in sometimes portals can be scary, right? What's on the other side? Should I walk through it? Should I see? And so then it became a lot about discussing fear with students. What are you afraid of? How do we conquer our fears? And we would do a series of meditations and circle discussions and journaling. And then I'd have the students, okay, make a fear portal. Draw your fears in the portal. And then so many things would come up. And, I was servicing a lot of different students at the time. And so it was interesting to see the commonalities between what little kids were afraid of. And for little kids, it's very symbolic, but I would have the adults in the room also partake, and they would say things about losing my loved ones, murder, the earth dying, and these are coming from, 7-year-olds, right? And then, like I'd mentioned earlier, we would shift the conversation to, well, what will it take for us to address these fears? How do we conquer them? How do we defeat them? And I feel like so many of the material that's available for kids talks about the idea of the hero, that's an archetype, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of superhero stuff that's really popular, defeating evil, right? So they were really always down to talk about it. And then eventually, the students sort of arrived at how a big part of conquering your fears is being brave. And that means being confident. And that could also, in another way, be about being sure about yourself, being safe and loving oneself, thinking about love. So then I found myself talking about the kids about well, what is love? And what do you love? What makes you feel loved? how do we spread love? And then, so I had them then take the fear portals that we had made, and I would have them in a very abstract expressionist way, take other colors and cover the fear and create a love portal, right? Thinking about what they love and transforming the marks, editing as they went, layering, redrawing. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic happening, this was in early 2018, 2019, I never got to finish, but I have these dreams of having a bi-national art exchange where students from the United States exchange art with students on the other side of the border in Mexico. And we talk about fear and love. So I think just living here also too, you become very aware of the misconceptions and misunderstandings that either side has of each other. And also the great harm that borders can create in oneself and also in the physical.
Yeah. So much beauty in there, and amazing how you're really digging into these huge, huge concepts. But I see an element of ritual in there too, and talking about the metronome and the mark making and how that almost like, you know, in a lot of these children's books and movies and shows and stuff, there's sort of magic involved and sort of rituals that you do in order to cross through a certain portal. So this is, you know, you're doing this mark making, energetic mark making, and like going to the beat. And then as you do that, you're creating this portal. Yeah, just really beautiful to picture that and hear about how you're facilitating this for students and for their families.
You know, it's so fascinating because I feel like a lot of magic has been taken out of life in general. And the children that I was working with would get so activated whenever they were talking about magic that they would experience in, like you said, the video game, a lot of the role-playing games, have you do, set amount of tasks, or like you have to collect this and do this, and then you can do this. And so I think at the basis level, they understand that. And they were always down for whatever. They were like, all right, you know, they kind of inherently understood, like, okay, well, we're going to meditate, and then we're going to stay in a circle, and one by one, we're going to talk about these concepts. And obviously you work up to that with co-creating a community. You know, a lot of the work I do is on the basis of the relationship that I create with my students, as well as the environment and container that it's withheld in. But in a way, that work with how to make a portal, the portal project in the classroom, when I was outside of the classroom, I was making my own portals. And that's my body of work, Portals of Possibility, where it is a lot about ritual. You know, I think in the schools, I have to be a little careful about how I word things, you know, because I feel like there's sometimes this association with religion, I guess, with like ritual. Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, that can really alarm people. But in a way, you know, I take a very dialogical approach to education. I'm very much influenced by Paulo Freire, you know, pedagogy of the oppressed, and thinking about how drawing on the students' experiences should really be the highlight of your approach, and making space for student dialogue about a lot of these large ideas, because they're grappling with these questions, especially at the high school level. And there's not a lot of spaces where you can just talk about things. I do this with my high schoolers now, where we start every class, every 10 minutes, sort of as like a student radio podcast show, where I display a student submitted quote of the day, a song of the day, a question of the day. We do a meme feature, pet feature, show and tell.
I love it.
Kind of nostalgic for them, at least in the high school level, but they're into it. And anyway, we start with dialogue, and the students, I started the year by me kind of always posing the big questions, ranging from some very simple, like, do you prefer peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to ham sandwiches, right? Or like Instagram or TikTok, right? To questions that get them thinking creatively and really truly tapping into what they believe. Like, you know, something along the lines of, why do we fall in love? Or do you believe in aliens? Or and now the students are submitting questions, and let me tell you, like the other day in my AP studio art class, I had a student ask, is there a point to being ethical? And we had this incredible discussion about ethics and the implications of certain worldviews. And was just incredible. And I just sit back and just let them talk. And, some students are more comfortable in the chat, some jump on the audio. But at the end of the day, you need to align your practices as a teacher with what you believe. And I believe that I tell them I'm one of the biggest students in the room here. Okay. Lifelong learner. And I can learn from you as much as you can learn from me. It is mutual.
Absolutely. And I love that start with dialogue and just talking about the importance of building relationships and building the environment first, that has to come before you're really diving into these big topics that can be really heavy.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I would love to hear more about your work. I feel like we could just keep talking about teaching for hours and hours. And you've mentioned your Portals of Possibility project. I want to hear more about it.
So while I was a visiting teacher working part-time and also working in a grocery store, I don't know how I made some time, but I guess I had time to also be making art. And while I was teaching how to make portals with the students, I was doing my own portals at home. And the portals that I would create are, one, in my mind, a continuation of the symbol of the third space, right? That inherently connects to my identity as a mixed person. I have European and Mexican heritage, as a bisexual, as well as a teacher/artist, which is, in some respects, a difference in class. So often I would, come home from work, right? I'd work a double. I'd be teaching in the schools and then working my service job at night. And then I come home and I don't know, I guess sometimes you got to rage. I mean, I don't have kids, so I guess I have a lot of energy. I've always been known for my energy, but yeah. And then I would just invite some of my friends who, like I had mentioned, in the service industry, they're all creatives, right? Musicians, people who paint and do all sorts of different things. They just come over and we chill, and I would invite them to make the portal with me, as an extension of this idea of co-creation. And the only stipulation, they're really how sometimes with artworks, the artist can impose sort of, I guess, rules or an approach to a work. I'm only going to do this, or I'm only going to draw in this way. You see that sometimes in abstraction.
Yeah, completely.
I'm gonna just paint with my nose, or I think about Janine Antoni's Butterfly Kisses. I'm going to only put mascara on my eyelashes and kiss the canvas with my eyelashes 1,000 times.
I love that.
These are the works that inspire me. And anyway, the only stipulation that I had kind of thought of as I'd be making portals with my friends is that it just kind of has to sort of be circular at the end. But even then, I really tried to approach the canvas as I would my life. And what I mean by that is I was going through a lot of transformation, I'd say personally, when I came out to California. I feel like anytime anyone makes a big move, you kind of recreate yourself a little bit. You can sort of abandon the old preconceived notions of who you were or who, were known to be. And coming out here felt like a new person, and in my own life, trying to make choices and live an intentional life where I wasn't preoccupied with what other people thought of me, I guess, and really tapping into what made me happy and those personal leaps and bounds I was making in terms of my self-concept. I wanted to translate that into the canvas by, if you made a mark that you thought looked bad, whatever, just keep layering, keep going, go crazy, really, and tapping into my, I guess, really physical nature. Because in the end, you can always fix a mistake.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's something I tell my students all the time. I was kind of I was actually living what I taught, I guess. I say this to students all the time, oh, don't worry, you made a mistake, just rework it, or, and for some reason it was just, I had finally embodied the lesson. I think there's a difference. You can kind of talk about what you know, but until you've lived it, I don't think you really have too strong of ground to stand on.
Yeah. And I feel like this connects back to the way you talked about leading that project with students, where they ended up creating these like fear portals and then transforming them into love portals that they're, again, this like layering and covering up something, changing one thing. Yeah, that you can always continue this transformation.
Yeah, that, I mean, to me was the journey of self-transformation and self-acceptance ultimately. And I think as someone who has, like, I think growing up, I didn't really fit in with any crowd because, like when I was around my white friends, I didn't feel as white as them. When I was around my brown friends, I didn't feel as brown as them. When I was around my straight friends, I felt a lot more different as a queer person. And then when I'm with my queer friends, I felt self-conscious of also liking men. And, at a certain point, I had to learn, like, you are worthy. The space you take up is worthy. And it's not in either category. You're your own thing, Jess.
Yes. Yeah, you are worthy in that liminal space, in that like in between. And maybe this is too visual or metaphorical. Like I'm picturing these walls like closing in around you and you just pushing against them and like bulging them out to make your space bigger.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I come to that question a lot in my work, like, what life lessons can we learn as individuals and as a society from the metaphor of a portal? How can we embrace liminality as a tool of resistance in a binary world? That to me is what definitely guides my art practice.
That's beautiful. I want to just sit with that.
And it's been a long time coming, but it took a lot of work to get here. Because I feel like just having to just jump straight into teaching when I was 18, that blocked me as a creative. I felt like a blocked creative up until that point when I had that little bit of extra time and energy to devote to my art practice. I was able to come into myself.
Yeah, beautiful.
When you're a blocked art teacher, like, oh my goodness, as honestly, it's a miserable existence. I felt it. I lived it, where you come home from a full day of work and you are around and facilitating creativity happening. And you get home and you just don't have the life force sometimes to be able to devote that same care and attention to yourself. I think a big part of my cultural upbringing was to put others before myself. And I had to unlearn that in a way.
Yeah. I feel like that's something we're taught as women, especially, that care for others comes first. But then there's the metaphor I hear all the time, or the whole like airline thing of like, put on your own oxygen mask first. But that has so much meaning.
And yet until you live it and learn it and embody it, then I think you understand. But, a lot of days, there's a lot of people who talk the talk, but don't walk the walk.
Yeah.
And that's a systemic problem. We see that as evidence through our politicians, through the supposed quote unquote change makers of the country.
Yeah, I feel myself struggling there too, being, I'm a white educator and grew up sort of middle class. Like my mom was a teacher, my parents were not together. So some struggle there, but like not on the level of some of the students that I've had. And now I'm married to a Latino and, trying to navigate my daughter having these dual identities and what that means for her as well.
Yeah.
But I definitely see myself struggling and struggling with this idea of being a change maker or somebody who doesn't always, or like can't figure out always how to walk the walk.
And being a parent of a mixed child, inherently, she has her own identity that is different from either yours or your husband's.
Yeah.
If you think about it. And for me, just being connected to other mixed people really also was a part of becoming more wholly myself. Because the Mexican Americans in my family, were very much affected by assimilation. And my family lost the language in efforts to appear more white. And moving to Southern California, being so close to the motherland, if you will.
Yeah.
really, like, I met some really proud Mexican Americans who found out that I was mixed, that I had Mexican heritage, and they were like, be proud, and I was immersed in Chicano culture moving out here. And I've learned so much more about myself, and it's been an incredible, beautiful journey being able to connect with that part of my family and my own history, and also understanding a lot of things, like just how I was raised. It kind of came all full circle, like, oh, that's where that came from. I feel like in particularly a lot of Mexican American women, I'm thinking also about Gloria Anzaldoa, her work and what she speaks about in terms of having to care and mother. And a lot of times that flattens women and has them only seen as one thing, always having to be selfless, always thinking about the collective before the self. But as I've learned, you need to hold a balance of the individual and the collective, the third space, right?
Yes.
And I'm not a centerist, but I'm something I've learned is that, again, thinking about this idea, how is liminality a tool of resistance in a binary world? Like, how can we take the collective knowledge of all these different identities intersecting to ultimately rise above the idea that there's two sides to everything? Because I feel like that begets a lot of problems, a lot of pain and harm in any sense of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. The grays that encompass most of the world. It's not just, there's not a duality. It's not just black and white. Like, everything is some shade of gray.
Things are way more complex than they appear. And I feel like a lot of the forces that be, or, the master class, the billionaires, however you want to label them, they benefit from this space not being liberated.
Yeah. And even thinking of the benefits of the 1% and how this political system that we have, really, we're encouraged to think of us versus them. And we're split along this line. And that it's, one side is good and one side is bad. And, depends which side you're on, what you think that is, that there's no room in the middle. Yeah. I love this idea, thinking of like, how do we make that room? And that image is coming up in my head again of like pushing those walls apart, like opening that space.
You're giving me some ideas, because I love lifting weights. So
yes,
I'm retired from rugby now, but I enjoy lifting weights. It helps me be in my body. That would be so fascinating to create sort of a sculptural performance with this mental image.
Yes,
that
do
has
it.
Popped up, and actually, flexing on people, right? And
but I love that. And I mean, I love that how that also in some ways I feel like speaks to femininity, and this idea of women are these fragile creatures that our strength is taken away.
Oh yeah. I've definitely always, I think to my own sexual orientation, sexual identity, when it comes to I've always been a more masculine woman, a strong woman. In a lot of ways, related to a lot of young men in the way that when they're growing up, they just needed a channel for their aggression. And I was angry when I was young, and rugby changed my life. It was crucial in empowering me to take up space, to be strong. When you're a young woman and you learn how to tackle somebody to the ground, stop them from moving, you walk into a room differently. You'll walk into an interview differently, knowing that your body can destroy, I don't know. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but it's a tough sport. It's full contact, no padding. Learning how to use your body in that way definitely had some psychological consequences for the good, in making me really appreciate the things that my body did, and not necessarily about what my body looked like. Because yes, the pervasive message for young women is to take up the least amount of space possible, and from a very early age, I I was like, that's not for me.
Yes. Take up space. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would love to get into our last couple questions.
Yeah.
So one, what are you curious about right now?
I'm curious about power hierarchies, and honestly, the very institution of school.
Mm-hmm.
To me, I think that as teachers, if we want to see systemic change happen at large levels, we need to start with the micro, right? Trust your students. Think about and have some sort of, I guess, metacognition as to what's happening in your class, and have your students question it too. Absolutely. How can you keep pushing at some of the things that we sort of do unconsciously always?
Yeah, I feel like this speaks to, uncovering your unconscious biases, but also just taking a moment and thinking about the things that you sort of naturally, unconsciously do that are really positive. Like, how can we harness that and do it more?
Yeah, as a teacher, I think you have to break the rules, because you're ultimately the buffer between the state and your students.
Yes.
And you need to be filtering the stuff that is harmful, and you need to create more of what is human.
Yeah, that's such a powerful idea and so true, that you're the buffer between these systems of power and your students, your kids that you're working with. And they're still kids, even if they're in high school. Okay, I have just a kind of fun, silly question. What is your favorite food?
Favorite food. You know what? My go-to is always a torta. There's this place in San Diego, Señor Mango's, that has the best veggie torta. You got to get it with chipotle mayo and the pickled jalapenos, eat carrots. Yeah, they use panela. It's a really, really good sandwich, really filling. It's homey to me. Yes, I'm going to say a torta.
I love it.
Always down for a torta.
Yes. Yeah. So much good food down there. I mean, I guess we've got some good food up here in LA too.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. It's quite similar too.
Yeah. Oh, is there anything we missed? Anything I should have asked but didn't get to?
There is this question where it mentions like any BIPOC artists that you've shared that you felt were impactful. And I did want to make a little comment concerning that. In education currently, because of the events of the summer, there is this push for re-examining the canon of artists that you show, right?
Yeah.
To make it a more anti-racist curriculum. However, I feel that there's definitely a difference between multiculturalism and true liberatory education. And it's all well-intended, right? The well-intended of, re-examination of your curriculum. But just in my opinion, I think multiculturalism fails to question what I keep talking about, this idea of the power structures in your own classroom. And you'll continue to oppress your students and only perpetuate the colonial agenda of control and disempowerment if you just simply think that representation is adequate in truly changing the system.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I think maybe do you think I need to reword that or adjust? Like, I've been sort of trying to shift these questions, and as you saw, I definitely did not stick to my questions.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
But yeah, it's something, I think it's important that we're always kind of critical of what we're saying, what we're doing, the questions we're asking, and even here in this podcast space, like how do I need to change? What am I doing that can be harmful, even unintentionally? And I completely agree with the point you're making that, yeah, that is like maybe a very beginning starting point. If you've been teaching all dead white guys, like shifting that is like a little baby step.
Wake up, people. I hope at this point, but if I can speak to the profession, people are at all different stages of this transformation. But if we're looking to the people who've been doing the work, your position as a teacher in and of itself can be harmful, and you need to realize that and think about power. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And how do you give up power in your classroom? Yeah. I feel like that's a question I've been asking myself. Like, how do I shift the power dynamic in the classroom?
Mm-hmm. If we're thinking about true liberation here, and that's what makes it dangerous. That's what makes folks like Angela Davis a terrorist to the United States government. She was a teacher who was put in prison because she questioned the system.
As soon as you bring that up, like fear immediately comes up.
Like,
yep,
that's what I'm talking about. We got to address fear too.
It's like, just making slow moves so that I don't want that to happen to me. Like, then the self-care kicks in, like the selfishness almost.
Well, yeah, I mean, it takes a self-examination. You know, are you going to be on the side of the oppressor? Or are you going to be on the side of the people?
Yeah. Yeah. We had a workshop with Alicia Mernick. She led a workshop for this Art Educators Lounge community meetings that I've been co-hosting once a month.
I've seen those. Yeah.
Yeah. So she led one sharing an identity mapping project that she does with students.
Yes. Yeah. So important.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have my AP students do that. And I model by showing them mine and all the different identities and roles that we hold. Absolutely.
Yes. Same sort of idea. So great. But I think I was bringing that up because there was a lot of talk about how do we approach this? We're working within these systems, but I have the backing of my organization. Even the schools I work with, the admin is totally on board with me at least bringing up these topics and pushing my way forward. Whereas some of the teachers that had joined us were in schools and situations where if they even mentioned the words social justice or brought in identity as a topic, their admin, their parents, or even their students would give some pushback. So we tried to talk about what can you do in that situation? Like, where do you go? Where do you start this work?
Through self-examination and the cultivation of empathy is what comes to mind. I mean, I think by and large, our society has been robbed of empathy.
Yeah.
You know, we've been dehumanized on a collective scale where we feel disconnected from things, you know, and like I had mentioned, it's this fine balance, right, of the collective and the individual. I think a lot of people get afraid when they hear words like socialism or communism. And in the same way, it's not going to be true liberation if just a different oppressor takes over and then just puts forth their agenda.
Right.
So I'm in it for thinking about liberation would acknowledge the individual as well as the collective in regard to us having the ability to have an individual experience, right? We are the self, but then inherently we are all connected through being earthlings, right? to being a part of this world, of the trees and the soil and the water and the air.
That's beautiful. I love the reconnecting with your own body.
Absolutely. Overarchingly, the society is too mental. We're all up in our minds, and we've, especially in the United States, been really cut off from our bodies in a lot of ways. Just think about the way in which your body is when you're in school, right? Like you're
policing bodies.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And that is where, you know, we have some egregious racist practices kind of go underneath the radar to some, but then to others, it's like, you know, the most devastating thing, right? There's a policing of bodies. And so often the school system aims to police the bodies. And that could be the first step, is thinking about, like, how are your students' bodies in your classrooms? Like, in terms of what are they doing? And with hybrid learning, let me tell you, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with when students return to class. They were expecting one thing when, just for the sheer feasibility of having like 20 students online and 5 in person, everyone's got to be on that laptop still. You know, even though you're in the same room as your student, they're watching you through a screen.
Yeah. And then I think about the power we have as teachers to let go of some of the common rules. You know, you have to be sitting at your desk, your hands are folded nicely, and like no hats allowed, including, you know, all of those things, no hoodies, all, you know, whatever. We police how they dress, we police how they move. But then thinking about how the pandemic also shifted, you know, like you do actually have to wear the mask. Like I can't loosen up on that one.
More
and
policing of bodies. And on one hand, I understand, especially in communities of color where the effects of COVID have been devastating, and maybe it's about finding a balance. And it's interesting because in the name of safety and security, historically, the government has made a lot of move towards infringing a lot of one's freedoms. And I think as educators, we would be remiss if we didn't consider these implications in how we are apparata of the state, continuing some of these things. So I think ultimately it's about self-reflection and thinking about what really matters and being ethical. And like I mentioned before, you are the barrier between you and the state with your students. So you should have your own conscience in terms of this. And I would expect the same thing for police officers, right? Do we trust our police officers to not enact on laws that they view as unjust? I think as teachers, we need to be asking ourselves these same things.
Yeah. Can we really be that buffer and stand up when we feel we need to?
Right. Yeah. Like failing students in the pandemic. I think that's something as a teacher, you need to put your foot down and say, I am not failing any student during the pandemic because that is a form of child abuse. Saying, I refuse.
And then one thing that came up in that discussion with taking a stand like that there's an aspect of how far can I go before losing my job? And am I willing to take that risk? Am I able to do that? If that's your sole income and you're reliant on that, like where it's hard working in a system where you don't agree with things that are going on, but you also have your own livelihood and your own, like the fear of repercussions against yourself.
That's my whole situation here.
Yeah.
Can you change the system from within?
Right. How do we do that? Like, how far can we push? I guess that's what we're always thinking. And again, that picture of like pushing the walls, how far can we bulge them out before they crack and before someone notices that crack and gets angry with us?
Exactly. And I think having faith in your community is a big part of that. The strength of the community, the strength of mutual aid. When Angela Davis was incarcerated, her community had her back because they knew she was being used as a symbol, as a lesson by the state. To any dissenters out there.
So much to think about.
I know. I'm just kind of in contemplation right now.
Yeah. Is there anyone that you would want to thank or give sort of a shout out to?
Definitely my family. If it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have what I have today, and I wouldn't have gone through what I've gone through. And for that, I'm so thankful for the lessons and their appreciation. So my mom, my dad, my sister Rachel, Veronica, all my friends and my partner, Jarrell, and my schools, all of my students. Absolutely. Hands down. Shout out Morse High School. Go Tigers.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah. I consider myself blessed. Every person and human being that I've ever come into contact with, I've learned something from, whether they're aware of it or not. So that I am thankful for.
Amazing. And then where can listeners connect with you online?
My website, www.jessrogawski.com. And I'm also on Instagram at @MsGreen __ is where you can find my work and contact me. I see and live the power of co-creation as something necessary for changing the world. And a part of that is collaborating and networking. So this is an open call to anyone who was inspired or does work that's in relationship to anything that I'm doing. Let's connect. Reach out. I'd love to hear from you.
Yes. And I love seeing those connections. Like that's what this is meant for. That's what this is all about. Like connect.
Yeah. You've been with this platform, a grand connector. And that, again, just thank you so much for creating this platform.
Yeah, no, I love seeing that and hearing about that. And, I feel like it's also selfish for me. Like I want to connect with people and learn from all of these amazing educators like yourself. So yeah, thank you so much for this. I love this conversation. Thank you so much, Jess.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for listening. As always, you can reach me at Teaching Artist Podcast on Instagram or teachingartistpodcast@gmail.com. Who do you want to hear from? Please share your recommendations of teaching artists. And if you loved this episode, please subscribe, leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow me. It really makes a big difference. Thank you.